So, here we are. If you've ended up here watching a video called Fall Asleep to the Rise and Fall of the Walking Dead, then I'm going to guess a few things about you. You've probably spent a meaningful chunk of your life in this world. You know what a walker is, you know what the claimers are, you have a feeling in your chest when you hear Bear McCreary's score doing that particular thing it does in the quiet moments. The Walking Dead isn't just something you watched, it's something that was around in the background of your life for over a decade. It showed up on Sunday nights, and you were there for it, or most of it anyway. And now you're here in bed or on the sofa, and you want to spend some time with it again. Not to rewatch it, that's a different commitment, but just to be in that world for a while. To let someone talk you through the whole thing, from the beginning to the end, and everything in between, at a pace that doesn't demand anything from you. That's what tonight is. We're going to go all the way back to Robert Kirkman and a black and white comic that debuted in 2003 with almost no fanfare whatsoever. Then we'll follow that comic to a bookstore in Burbank, California, where a filmmaker named Frank Darabont picked it up and had the thought that it would make extraordinary television. Then we'll follow it to AMC, to a pilot shot in Georgia, to a Halloween night in 2010 when the first episode aired and critics suddenly sat up very straight. We'll walk through the seasons as they came. The farm, the prison, the governor, terminus, the peak, and there was a very specific peak, a Sunday night in October 2014, when more people were watching The Walking Dead than had ever watched any other show in the history of cable television. That's a real number. We'll get to it, and then we'll walk through what happened after. The saviors, Negan, the decisions that started costing the show its audience one by one, the departures that left something irreplaceable missing, the slow long drift through a final season that still had moments worth caring about, even as the numbers that showed up to watch them had dropped by something like 90% from where they'd been. And then the spin-offs, because the dead, as it turns out, are very hard to keep buried. Dead City, Daryl Dixon in France for reasons that made more sense than they should. The ones who live finally giving Rick and Michonne the ending they deserved. It's a lot. 11 seasons and a universe of spin-offs. But we have time tonight, and this is the kind of story that deserves to be told all the way through. Before we get into any of it, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, it would actually mean a lot if you did. It's completely free, and it helps more than you might think. Right, that's enough of that. Now, let's go back to the beginning. But before we get properly into the history, let me say something about why this kind of retrospective feels worth doing for The Walking Dead specifically, as opposed to just any long-running show that peaked and then declined. The Walking Dead story is interesting because the gap between what it was and what it became is so large and so specifically traceable. It's not a mystery. The reasons the show was good when it was good, and the reasons it became less good when it did, are legible. You can point to specific decisions, specific moments, specific structural changes and say, this is where something shifted. That kind of clarity is actually relatively rare when you're talking about creative works. Most shows that decline do so gradually and diffusely, the quality seeping out across many small decisions that no single one of which looks like the cause. The Walking Dead's decline had causes you can name, which makes the story worth telling because it's also, in some ways, a story about how creative works survive commercial success, or fail to, and there's something actually worth honouring in what the show built at its peak. The Walking Dead at its best was not merely a popular show, it was a show that did things that serious drama is supposed to do. It took its characters seriously enough to let them be changed by what happened to them. It asked difficult moral questions without offering easy answers. It found genuine beauty in unexpected places, and it made you care deeply and specifically about fictional people to a degree that required real craft to produce. That deserves to be remembered, alongside the franchise fatigue and the cliffhanger controversy and the numbers falling off. So yes, let's go back to the beginning. There's a thing about The Walking Dead that's easy to forget after 11 seasons and multiple spin-offs and merchandise and video games and all the rest of it. At the very start, it was just a comic book, not a particularly well-funded one from a major publisher with a marketing campaign behind it. Just a man with an idea about what zombie stories were actually supposed to be about, and a small press willing to give him the space to tell it. Robert Kirkman launched the first issue of The Walking Dead in October 2003 through Image Comics. Image was known as the publisher of creator-owned material, the place you went when you had a story you wanted to own outright, which meant it was also the place you went when the big publishers had said no, or when you didn't want to deal with them in the first place. Kirkman was 24 years old. He had previously worked on a book called Battle Pope, which tells you quite a bit about where he was in his career at that point. The Walking Dead was something different. You could feel it in the first issue, not because the concept was wildly new, zombie apocalypses had been done, but because of the specific thing Kirkman was interested in. His stated intention, which he put in writing in the introduction to the first collected volume, was to tell a story about what happens after the movie ends. Most zombie stories end with the survivors escaping, or a cure being found, or humanity prevailing in some form. Kirkman wanted to ask what comes next. How do you live in a world where civilization is gone, and the dead outnumber the living? What does community mean? What does leadership mean? What do you owe to strangers, and what do you owe to yourself? Those are not horror questions. They're philosophy questions wearing horror clothes. And that distinction is what made The Walking Dead matter, from the very first issue, all the way through. We'll spend a lot of time tonight thinking about that idea, but for now, let's stay with the beginning. The Walking Dead as a comic ran for 193 issues, from October 2003 to July 2019. That's 16 years of continuous storytelling in a single medium, which is remarkable for any creator-owned book. Most comics either get cancelled, get bought out, or simply lose steam. Kirkman somehow kept his going long enough that it wrapped up about 3 years before the television show. It Inspired ended, and then ended it on his own terms, without warning, with a final issue that arrived in shops with no advance announcement. Many readers found out when they opened it. That's a particular kind of creative confidence. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The first issue introduced Rick Grimes, a sheriff's deputy from Cynthiana, Kentucky, who wakes up from a coma to find the world has ended. That setup, the man who misses the collapse and has to piece together what happened while also trying to survive what's happening now, is a clever one, because it puts the reader and the protagonist in the same position. You're both finding out together. You're both just as lost. Tony Moore drew the first 6 issues. His style was detailed and slightly rough around the edges, in a way that suited the material perfectly. The Walking Dead in those early issues looked properly decayed. The world looked genuinely deserted, and the black and white art gave everything a coldness that colour might have softened into something less unsettling. Moore and Kirkman had been friends since middle school, and there's a collaborative ease to those first issues that you can feel even decades later. After issue 6, Charlie Adlard took over the art. Adlard is a British artist, which I find quietly pleasing given where we are, and his style was scratchier and more expressionistic than Moore's, in ways that actually suited the story as it grew darker and more complicated. He stayed for the remaining 187 issues. The visual language of the comic in most people's memories is Adlard's language. Kirkman built the world methodically. He didn't rush. The first arc was just Rick finding his family outside Atlanta and falling in with a group of survivors camped in a forest outside the city. No major twists, no grand villains, just people trying to figure out how to keep going, and the friction that arises when you put a collection of frightened strangers under sustained pressure. The things that created conflict in those early issues were not the walkers. The walkers were almost background noise. The conflict was human. Jealousy, grief, Who gets to make decisions and why? What happens when the person making decisions is wrong? The character who arrived in the comic around issue 27 and became one of the most significant figures in the whole saga was the governor, the ruler of a place called Woodbury, who had built something that looked, from a distance, like civilization, and was something much darker up close. The governor story arc ran for a long time and was brutal in ways the early issues hadn't prepared you for. Characters you'd come to care about deeply were gone without warning, without ceremony, without the kind of narrative build-up that usually signals a major death in fiction. Kirkman made a point of this. He said openly that he wanted the deaths in The Walking Dead to feel like real deaths. Sudden, senseless, not given the dramatic weight that fiction normally provides, because real death doesn't come with dramatic weight. It just comes. That commitment to consequence was what made the comic different in ways that mattered, and it was what Frank Darabont responded to when he found it. Darabont discovered the comic in 2005, browsing a bookstore in Burbank, California. He picked up the first collected volume, took it home, read it in one sitting, and immediately began thinking about what it would look like on screen. This is the kind of story that sounds slightly mythologized in the retelling, the artist encountering the work that will change their trajectory. But by all accounts, it's accurate. Darabont was already a serious filmmaker. By 2005, he'd written and directed The Shawshank Redemption in 1994, which had bombed theatrically and then become one of the most beloved films of its generation through video rental and cable airings. He'd followed it with The Green Mile in 1999 and The Mist in 2007. His thing was Stephen King adaptations. His instinct was always for the human story beneath the genre surface. The Walking Dead, he later said, felt like a Stephen King story that Stephen King hadn't written, which is a perceptive thing to say about it. He approached Kirkman about the rights. Kirkman, who had remained protective of the material, partly because he'd seen what happened to creator-owned comics when Hollywood got involved and the creator had no leverage, was cautious. But Darabont was the right kind of person to be cautious around, meaning his vision for the adaptation was demonstrably close to what Kirkman had built, rather than being a reshaping of it into something more commercially palatable. Darabont spent several years trying to set the adaptation up. He pitched it to multiple networks. NBC passed, HBO passed, which is the most famous pass in the show's origin story, because HBO in 2006 was the obvious home for prestige genre television, and passing on The Walking Dead is the kind of thing that probably still comes up in television industry conversations as a cautionary tale. Eventually, Darabont found his way to AMC, and AMC, as it turned out, was exactly the right place, even if nobody knew it yet. There's something else worth sitting with about the comic before we move on from it entirely, which is just how much story Kirkman told across those 193 issues. This was not a modest enterprise. The Walking Dead in comic form ran long enough to introduce and kill characters that entire arcs of the television show were built around, and then moved past them into territory the show never reached. Negan, for instance. In the comics, the all-out war storyline, which roughly corresponds to seasons 7 and 8 of the television show, was not the end of Negan as a character. It was a turning point. After Rick chose to spare him rather than kill him, Negan spent years imprisoned, then was released, then gradually became something more complicated than a villain. Kirkman was interested in the question of what redemption looks like for someone who has done what Negan did, and the answer he arrived at was slow and uncomfortable, and did not ask you to forgive anything. The television show attempted the same arc, and largely succeeded, though it took longer to get there. The comic also went places the show never had the opportunity to reach. The Commonwealth arc, which the television show adapted for its final season, had already concluded in the comic by 2019. The story of rebuilding society, with all its familiar human failings intact, the class hierarchies and the power structures, and the institutional violence, was something Kirkman explored at length. And the final arc, the epilogue, which took place years after Rick's death and followed the world he had helped build, is among the most quietly moving things Kirkman wrote. It was the long answer to the question the first issue posed. Here is what it cost, here is what it was worth. The comic's influence on the television show was direct in some places and indirect in others. Certain scenes were adapted almost panel for panel. Certain characters were combined or split, or given different fates for reasons that made sense in the context of what the show was doing at a given time. Daryl Dixon does not exist in the comic. He was created specifically for the television adaptation, and he became one of the show's most beloved figures, which says something about what a collaboration between source material and adaptation can produce when both sides are operating in good faith. Norman Reedus had auditioned for a different role entirely. Merle, Daryl's older brother, and the casting team recognised something in his screen presence that they wanted to keep. Daryl was written for him, and Reedus inhabited the character with a physicality and a specific kind of quietness that the show built around for a decade. There are arguments to be made that Daryl Dixon is the show's most consistent creative success. A character who arrived as a secondary figure and became the emotional centre of the story across its later seasons without ever losing the thing that made him interesting in the first place. To understand what it meant for The Walking Dead to land at AMC, you need a brief detour into what AMC actually was in the mid-2000s. AMC stands for American Movie Classics. The channel launched in 1984 as a home for classic films, old Hollywood, golden age cinema, presented without commercials and without much in the way of on-air personality. It was a pleasant, niche offering, the kind of channel you'd turn to at 2 in the afternoon on a Sunday and find a black and white western that you'd seen before and were happy to see again. Which, as it happens, sounds quite comfortable, but it was not a long-term business model. It wasn't trying to be anything other than what was, and what it was wasn't enough. Then the media landscape shifted. The films that AMC was built around aged out of relevance for advertisers. Classic cinema from the 30s and 40s was not going to move products for the 18 to 49 demographic that cable networks depended on. AMC quietly dropped the no commercials policy, then the classics only policy, and found itself in an identity crisis. It was a film channel that had diluted what made it a film channel, and it needed to decide what it wanted to be. What it decided to be was somewhat improbably the most artistically ambitious cable drama network in the country. The pivot started with Mad Men in 2007. Matthew Weiner had developed the series while working on Becca, and after HBO passed on it, another notable pass, he brought it to AMC, which by that point was desperate for prestige original programming. Mad Men premiered to modest ratings but extraordinary critical response, and AMC suddenly had something it hadn't had before. The kind of cultural conversation around a show that made people feel like they were missing something if they weren't watching. Breaking Bad followed in 2008, Vince Gilligan's story of a chemistry teacher becoming a drug manufacturer was tonally and thematically very different from Mad Men, but it occupied the same creative register. Adult, serious, invested in character in ways that didn't condescend to the audience. AMC had two of the most critically admired shows on television before it had figured out how to market itself as the channel that made them. Into this context arrived The Walking Dead. And the thing about that context is that it shaped the show profoundly. If The Walking Dead had been made by a network that primarily made genre entertainment, a horror channel, a science fiction network, it would probably have been a different kind of show. More plot-driven, more focused on the mechanics of survival, less interested in the long, quiet scenes of people trying to figure out who they are in a world without structure. The AMC DNA, the Mad Men and Breaking Bad DNA, was all about interiority, about what happens to a person under sustained pressure, about character as the engine of drama rather than plot as the engine of character. Darabont fit that template. His films were always about people in impossible situations making impossible choices, and the moral weight of those choices. He had no interest in making a zombie show about zombie killing. He wanted to make a show about what it means to be human when all the things that define humanity, law, community, the social contract, have collapsed. AMC greenlit the pilot. They gave Darabont $3.4 million per episode for the first season, which was substantial for cable at the time. It wasn't HBO money, but it was more than anyone would have given a zombie show 5 years earlier, and it reflected both AMC's ambition and the genuine seriousness with which they were treating the project. The pilot was shot in Georgia. The state offered significant production tax credits, which mattered enormously for a show that was going to need to destroy cars and set things on fire and manufacture a convincing post-apocalyptic landscape on a cable budget. Atlanta became Kirkman's fictional Atlanta. The streets were emptied, the cars were arranged, and on a production level, the ambition was visible from the first day. There's something worth sitting with here, which is how unlikely all of this was. A creator-owned black and white comic from a small press, a filmmaker known for Stephen King adaptations, a classic film channel reinventing itself. None of these things obviously points toward what became one of the most watched shows in the history of cable television. But that's quite often how it works. The things that become cultural phenomena rarely do so because everything was designed to lead there. They do so because the right people with the right vision found the right moment. AMC was the right moment. Darabont was the right person. And what he made with what they gave him was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. One more thing about the production context that's worth knowing, because it shaped the show's visual DNA in ways that are still visible in the early seasons. The pilot was directed by Darabont himself, and he shot it on Super 16 film rather than digital. This was a deliberate choice that went against the prevailing economics of television production, which had largely moved to digital cameras by 2010. Film was more expensive to shoot on, more expensive to process, harder to work with on a television schedule. But it produced a specific quality of image, grainier, softer in the shadows, with a particular way of rendering the Georgia landscape, that gave the show a cinematic texture that digital production at that budget level couldn't replicate. The cinematographer for the pilot and much of the first season was David Boyd, who had worked on Carnival, another AMC show known for its visual ambition, and whose eye for the rural American South was exactly right for the story being told. The empty highways, the abandoned farmhouses, the overcast sky above Atlanta. Boyd lit them all with the restraint of someone who understood that the horror of the world was already there in the landscape, and that the camera's job was not to underline it, but to let it breathe. Greg Nicotero, who ran the special effects and makeup department, became in some ways the show's most consistent creative force across its entire run. Nicotero had trained under Tom Savini, the legendary horror makeup artist, and his work on The Walking Dead was from the first episode, a cut above what horror television had typically been given. The walkers were decomposing at different rates, in different ways based on logical principles of what they would have looked like at different stages of decay. Many walkers had individual designs, but far background walkers often reused simpler, generic looks. The work was painstaking and visible, and it gave the show a physical reality that made the horror land harder than it would have with generic zombie design. Nicotero also directed episodes across all 11 seasons, and several of his directorial contributions, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, No Way Out, What Comes After, were among the most technically accomplished the show produced. His commitment to the material was total and sustained in a way that very few people on the production managed across the full run. When you hear cast members and crew talk about the Walking Dead family, Nicotero's name comes up more often and more warmly than almost anyone else's. He was the continuous thread. All of this context, the film stock, the cinematographer, the makeup department, the AMC Prestige DNA, explains something about why the first season of The Walking Dead felt so different from what audiences expected when they sat down to watch a zombie show on Halloween night in 2010. They were expecting something they'd seen before, at a different budget and a different level of craft. What they got was something that looked and felt like a serious film that happened to have dead people in it. The Walking Dead premiered on October 31st, 2010, Halloween, which, as scheduling decisions go, is either an act of genius or an act of such obvious thematic convenience that it almost wraps around to genius. Either way, it worked. The first episode was called Days Gone By, and it opened with one of the most quietly remarkable sequences in the history of American drama television. Not remarkable because it was explosive or immediately gripping in the traditional sense, it was the opposite. Rick Grimes, in his sheriff's uniform, walks through the wreckage of a motorway pile-up, a red jerry can in his hand, looking for petrol. The world is still. Cars are crumpled and rusting. The sky is grey. There is a subtle musical score for the first few minutes of the pilot episode. The opening of the pilot uses ambient sound and a faint version of the main title theme. Wind, the scrape of Rick's boots, the creak of something settling, and then the teddy bear, picked up by a pair of small feet in slippers. Rick following those feet around the side of a car, calling out, assuming a child. And the child turns around, and she's been dead for a while, and Rick has to shoot her in the head. And he stands there looking at what he's just done, and the screen goes quiet again. That's the first 3 minutes of The Walking Dead. No context, no explanation, no previously on. Just, here is the world. Here is what the world costs. Start walking. The storytelling choice that followed was equally deliberate. The episode flashed back to show us Rick before the collapse. The conversation with his partner Shane in a police cruiser about the differences between men and women. The pursuit that ended with Rick getting shot. The hospital. It's a classic structure, filling in the before after showing us the after. And it worked because Andrew Lincoln's performance in both halves was calibrated precisely. The ease of a man in a world that made sense, then the bewilderment of a man in a world that didn't. Andrew Lincoln is worth talking about because he's doing something quite specific in this role that gets underappreciated. He's a British actor, born Richard Andrew Clutterbuck, which is one of those names that you can see very clearly why he changed it. He trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and had done primarily British television and film before The Walking Dead. He adopted a convincing American Southern accent for Rick Grimes and maintained it for 9 seasons, which is the sort of thing that sounds like a technical detail, but is actually the foundation on which everything else rests, because the moment that accent slips, so does the character, and Lincoln's never did. The first season was 6 episodes. That number is important because it's so small. Most American network dramas run 22 or 24 episodes per season. Even prestige cable dramas tend toward 12 or 13. 6 episodes meant that Darabont was making something closer to a long film than a traditional television season. Every episode mattered. There was no filler. There was no episode where the characters waited around for the plot to catch up with them. The season established its world with patience. The quarry camp outside Atlanta, where Rick's wife Laurie and son Carl had found shelter with his partner Shane and a collection of strangers. The tense, slow-burn dynamic between Rick and Shane, complicated by the fact that Shane had told Laurie her husband was dead and had begun a relationship with her in his grief, only for Rick to arrive alive. The introduction of Daryl Dixon and his older brother Merle, who between them contained more potential energy than any other new characters the season introduced. And Atlanta itself, which was terrifying in the best way. Rick riding a horse through empty streets that were clean and sunlit and absolutely full of the dead. That image became iconic almost immediately, and it's still one of the most striking visual moments the show ever produced. The CDC subplot in the final 2 episodes gave the season its emotional anchor. The survivors reaching the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. finding the last surviving scientist, Dr. Jenner, learning what he knows about the outbreak. What Jenner tells them, whispered into Rick's ear at the end of the episode TS-19, becomes one of the show's long mysteries. We don't hear it, Rick does, and the weight of it stays on his face for episodes afterwards. It's revealed much later. Everyone who dies reanimates, regardless of cause of death, which means everyone is already infected, which changes the moral calculus of everything that follows. The first season drew 5.35 million viewers for its premiere. Modest, promising. AMC had ordered it hoping for something in the range of Mad Men's numbers, which were themselves not enormous, but carried cultural weight well above their viewing figures. What they got was a slow-building phenomenon, reviews that were essentially unanimous, and a sense that something had arrived that was going to be around for a long time. AMC renewed the show for a second season, before the first one had even finished airing. The budget was confirmed, the episode order was expanded, from 6 episodes to 13, and Darabont began work on the second season, with the full knowledge that the show had earned its place. Let me linger here for a moment with some specific episodes from that first season, because they deserve more than a general description. Tell It to the Frogs, the third episode, was where the show established something that would define it for years. The quarry camp as a functioning miniature society, with all the tensions that implies. There was a scene in that episode between Rick and Laurie, him returned from Atlanta, her adjusting to his return, that was handled with the kind of quiet specificity that you don't find in shows that are primarily interested in their genre. The physical awkwardness between them, the things not being said, the fact that she had a life during his absence that she'd have to account for, and the fact that he had no idea. It was a marriage scene in a zombie show, and it was as carefully written as anything in a prestige drama. Wildfire, the fifth episode, was where the show introduced something that would resonate all the way through to its finale. The question of what to do with the infected. Jackie and Jim, and what happened to them. The group's argument about mercy and practicality, and whether those things were compatible. These were the conversations the show had always wanted to have, and Wildfire was the first episode where they occupied the centre of the story rather than its margins. TS-19, the finale, was divisive at the time. Some viewers found the CDC subplot a detour, a way of providing exposition about the world's condition that could have been handled differently. I never agreed with that reading. The CDC felt like exactly the right place for the season to end. A building full of answers that turned out not to be answers, a scientist who had stayed at his post long past the point of reason, a temporary safety that the characters knew, even before they knew it was ending, couldn't last. And the conversation between Rick and Jenna, the whispered revelation, set up something that the show would pay off slowly and carefully over the following seasons. It was, as first seasons go, extraordinarily complete. 6 episodes, no weak links, a clear sense of what the show was and what it wanted to do. The kind of beginning that a show very rarely manages, and that creates both enormous opportunity and enormous pressure for what follows. And then something happened that nobody had predicted, and that changed the show in ways that took years to fully understand. There's a behind-the-scenes story to The Walking Dead that doesn't get talked about as much as it should, partly because it's uncomfortable, and partly because by the time most people were paying close attention to the show, it was already over. It's the story of Frank Darabont's firing, and it matters because understanding what happened to the showrunner is one of the keys to understanding what happened to the show. Here's what happened, as best as it can be pieced together. AMC had a significant hit on its hands with Season 1. The critical reception, the growing viewership, the cultural conversation, all of it was pointing towards something that could be a flagship property for years. But AMC was, at its heart, a network that had come to prestige drama late and was still figuring out its relationship to the economics of it. Mad Men and Breaking Bad were acclaimed, but they were not inexpensive, and they were not, by the standards of broadcast television, enormous ratings performers. The Walking Dead was shaping up to be genuinely mass market in a way neither of those shows had been, and that changed how AMC thought about it. Specifically, it changed how AMC thought about the budget. The decision that preceded everything else was this: AMC doubled the episode order for Season 2 from 6 to 13 and simultaneously cut the per episode budget. The mathematics of that are worth a moment's attention. More episodes at less money per episode means more content, but not necessarily at a lower total cost. From a network's perspective, this is good. You have a popular show, you make more of it, you spend proportionally less. From a showrunner's perspective, making more than twice as many episodes with a smaller per episode allocation is a different kind of problem entirely. Darabont had begun work on Season 2 with a specific creative vision, with scripts prepared, with a clear sense of the story he wanted to tell. The budget cut changed what was possible. The disagreements with AMC executives became more frequent. The relationship deteriorated through the spring and early summer of 2011. On July 22, 2011, Frank Darabont appeared at San Diego Comic-Con to promote The Walking Dead's second season. He sat on the panel, answered questions, talked about the show with evident enthusiasm and commitment. 3 days later, he was fired. The cast found out separately. Sarah Wayne Callies, who played Laurie Grimes, learned about it from Robert Kirkman. Stephen Yeun, who played Glenn, had heard a rumour shortly after Comic-Con and passed it to Sarah Wayne Callies, who dismissed it as impossible because, as she put it, Darabont had just delivered AMC the biggest hit they'd ever had. John Bernthal, who played Shane, later said that the cast was devastated. Callies, in a subsequent interview, described it as feeling like an assassination. She had been given 6 completed scripts for Season 2 by Darabont a month before shooting began, fully written, polished, ready, and she told Kirkman that if he thought the cast couldn't tell the difference between a script written by Frank Darabont and a script written by anyone else, he was out of his mind. That's a revealing thing to say, not because it's a criticism of whoever came after. Glenn Mazzara, who stepped into the showrunner role, is by all accounts a skilled television writer, but because it points to something that matters about how the show had come to exist. And I find it genuinely hard, looking at those first 6 episodes now, to disagree with her. There's a quality in them that you can feel even without being able to name it precisely. A patience, a willingness to be slow. Darabont didn't just run The Walking Dead. In a very specific way, he was its creative identity. His instincts about pacing, about silence, about letting emotional moments breathe without dialogue. Those instincts were in the fabric of those 6 first season episodes, and they were not something that could be delegated or replicated by committee. Mazzara took over and made Season 2, which premiered on October 16, 2011. And Season 2 was, despite everything, largely good. The Herschel's farm storyline, the group taking shelter on a farmhouse property, trapped by the search for a missing child named Sophia, was slower than Season 1, and more interior and divided audiences fairly sharply at the time. Some viewers found it tedious, others, with the benefit of distance, recognised it as some of the most effective character work the show ever did. The Shane and Rick dynamic reached its conclusion there. The discovery of what was in Herschel's barn was one of the show's finest moments, and the season finale, beside the dying fire, was urgent and disorienting in exactly the right ways. But there was something missing, a particular quality of stillness, of weight, that the first season had carried and the second had intermittently. It's difficult to quantify, and I'm not sure it's entirely fair to attribute it purely to Darabont's absence. Productions change when key personnel leave, but they're also affected by budget shifts, by the natural growing pains of expanding an episode order, by 50 other variables. What I'm fairly confident of is that the show never again had quite the same cinematic deliberateness, that Darabont brought to those first 6 hours. Then Mazzara was fired after season 3. 2 showrunners gone in 2 seasons. The pattern of instability was establishing itself early, and it would prove to be one of the most consistent features of the show's production history. Scott Gimple took over for season 4 and stayed through season 8, which gave the later years more stability. But the first 3 seasons had cycled through 3 different creative visions, and each transition had costs. This is one of the things that makes the Walking Dead story interesting to trace, actually. Not just what happened on screen, but the turbulence happening below it, shaping the decisions being made, the stories being told and not told. Season 2 averaged around 6.9 million viewers. The show was growing. The audience could feel something good was being made, even through the behind-the-scenes turbulence. And season 3 was about to make a very large number of people very certain of that. But before we leave season 2, there are a few things worth acknowledging about what Mazzara built with it, despite the circumstances. The second half of season 2, from the episode Nebraska through the finale, is considerably stronger than its first half, and that's almost certainly a reflection of Mazzara's increasing control over the material. Nebraska, the mid-season premiere, opened with a moment that told you the show was willing to do things that drama television usually avoided. Rick shot 2 strangers in a bar, not walkers, living men, for practical reasons, and then he sat with what he'd done, not for long, but for long enough that you knew the show understood the weight of it. Shane's descent across season 2 was handled with a patience that Bernthal deserved. Shane Walsh, as Kirkman had written him, was not simply a villain. He was an argument. He was the argument that the world after the collapse required a different kind of person to survive it, that Rick's attachment to pre-collapse morality was a liability rather than a virtue, that the people most likely to keep themselves alive were the ones most willing to abandon the things that had made them human. Shane believed this, and he acted on it, and the show took his position seriously enough to show specifically why he was wrong. Better Angels, the penultimate episode of the season, concluded Shane's arc. The confrontation between Rick and Shane in the field at night, the way it ended, and then what happened immediately after, was among the most precisely staged sequences of the show's first 3 seasons. Bernthal made Shane's death matter in a way that was entirely a consequence of his performance. He'd spent 2 seasons building a man who was actually convinced he was right, and the end of that conviction looked, in his hands, like something real being extinguished. Mazzara also introduced the prison in the final seconds of the season 2 finale, showing it in the distance as Rick and the group unknowingly camped nearby after they fled the farm. One image, no dialogue. The audience understood immediately where the story was going. It was the kind of confident ending that builds anticipation without over-explaining itself. He was fired after season 3. 2 showrunners gone in the first 3 seasons. The pattern of instability was establishing itself early, and it would prove to be one of the most consistent features of the show's production history. Scott Gimple took over for season 4 and stayed through season 8, which gave the later years more stability, but the first 3 seasons had cycled through 3 different creative visions, and each transition had costs. There's a moment in the season 3 premiere, an episode called Seed, where Rick and the group push open the gates of an abandoned prison and begin clearing it. The walkers inside are in various stages of decay, some of them wearing guard uniforms, some in civilian clothes, the remnants of what was presumably a failed evacuation. The group moves through them methodically. No one panics, no one hesitates. They've been doing this for long enough that it's become routine. And that routineness is the point. The time jump between season 2 and season 3 has changed these people. They're harder, quieter, more coordinated. They've stopped being survivors improvising and started being something closer to soldiers operating. The baby bump on Laurie's stomach tells you months have passed. The way Rick moves through the cell block tells you what those months were like. It's a remarkably efficient piece of storytelling for an opening sequence. The show communicating a year's worth of character development in about 3 minutes, without a word of exposition. And it set the tone for what Season 3 would be, a more propulsive, more confident show, one that had found its rhythm and was ready to do things with it. The prison became the series' most visually distinctive location, and also its most thematically rich. There's something inherently interesting about a group of people trying to build safety in a place that was designed to contain people against their will. The fences that keep the walkers out are the same fences that once kept prisoners in. The cell blocks that become bedrooms were once punishment. The show was aware of the irony and folded it into the story quietly, not as a heavy-handed metaphor, but as a texture present for those who noticed it. David Morrissey arrived as the governor, the ruler of Woodbury, in Walk With Me, the 3rd episode of the season. Morrissey is an English actor, and his governor was not the one the comic had presented. The comic's governor was more overtly savage, more immediately monstrous. Morrissey's version was more unsettling in a different way. He was charming. He was reasonable in public. He held community meetings and resolved disputes and seemed actually invested in the welfare of the people under his protection. The horror was in the gap between the public face and the private one, the aquarium of heads, the arena fights, the specific cruelty he kept hidden behind the performance of normalcy. Morrissey played it with a remarkable control. There are scenes between his governor and Rick, the two communities eventually confronting each other, that are tense in the way very good drama is tense. Not because someone is about to be hurt, but because you're watching two people who are each certain they're right, and you can see the ways in which both of them are wrong. Laurie died in Killer Within, the 4th episode of the season, during childbirth in the prison. Maggie delivered the baby. Carl, 13 years old, was the one who had to prevent his mother from reanimating. It's among the most emotionally devastating sequences the show ever produced. Handled without sentimentality, anchored in Andrew Lincoln's performance in the aftermath. The scene where Rick learns what happened is wordless, and Lincoln communicates the entire architecture of grief in about 45 seconds. Season 3's most celebrated single episode was Clear, which aired in the 14th episode. It returned Rick, Carl and Michonne to King County, Rick's hometown, in search of weapons. And when they arrived, they found Morgan Jones, the man from the very first episode, who had sheltered Rick and shown him how to survive that first terrible day. Alone in the town, he cleared of every walker and covered in traps and warnings, and a kind of elaborate survival system that had clearly taken a long time and a significant portion of his sanity to construct. Lenny James played Morgan, and Clear is probably the finest hour of performance he's ever given, which is saying something because he's a very good actor. The episode was written by Scott Gimple, who was still a writer rather than showrunner at that point, and it worked because it asked a deeply uncomfortable question. What's the cost of surviving alone? Morgan had kept himself alive at the expense of everything else. He had lost his son. He had lost his reason for fighting. He had become something efficient and hollow. The episode didn't resolve that cleanly. It just showed it and let it sit. Season 3 averaged 10.75 million viewers, a 56% increase over Season 2. That number is worth a moment because of what it represented. Organic, word-of-mouth driven growth. The kind that comes from a show that people are recommending to each other because it's doing something worth recommending. The audience for The Walking Dead in these years wasn't just watching, they were talking about it. Scott Gimple took over as showrunner for Season 4, and the show he inherited was operating at a high level. His Season 4 was ambitious in a specific way, structurally fragmented, telling different characters' stories through different episodes, willing to slow down and spend time in a character's head even when the plot would have been better served by acceleration. The flu outbreak arc in the prison's early episodes was quieter and more contemplative than anything the show had done since the Herschel's farm season. It asked what community costs what leadership costs, what it means to keep making decisions for people who depend on you when you're not sure any of your decisions are the right ones. The Season 4 average of 13.33 million viewers, a 24% increase on Season 3, told you that the audience was following wherever the show wanted to take them. That trust, that willingness to follow, was something the show had earned carefully over 4 years, and it was something that would need to be treated carefully. These things, once spent, are not easily recovered. The individual episode that stands out most from Season 4, for me, is The Grove. It's the 14th episode of the season, set in a cottage on a quiet stretch of road, following Carol, Tyrese, and 2 young sisters, Lizzie and Mika, who are heading for Tuamihnos with baby Judith. It's the most morally difficult episode the show ever produced, and it earned that difficulty through patience. The entire season had been building toward it, and it arrived with no special announcement. No sense of being a finale or a set piece. It was just a quiet episode in a quiet place that went somewhere irreversible. Melissa McBride's performance in that episode is among the finest single-episode pieces of work in the show's entire run. The scene by the wildflower patch, which I won't describe in more detail than that, for those who haven't seen it, required her to play something nearly impossible. A character doing an unthinkable thing while the camera stayed with her, and making the audience understand, not agree, not forgive, just understand. That's the hardest thing an actor can be asked to do. McBride did it without visible effort, which made it hurt more. The Grove was written by Scott Gimple, and it's the clearest statement of what Gimple understood about the show that his predecessor showrunners had understood too, but which he articulated most precisely. That the apocalypse in The Walking Dead was always a moral testing environment, not an adventure, not a survival challenge, a place where human beings were stripped of the protections that civilization provides, law, community, the assumption that other people would stop you from going too far, and ask to find out what they actually were. Most of what they found was not reassuring, but the finding mattered. Season 4 also had After, the opener of the second half, which split the post-prison group across separate storylines and followed Rick and Carl alone in a quiet house, while Rick recovered from the governor's assault. Carl's growing, frightening competence, Rick unconscious, looking dead, Carl not knowing if he was, and then the conversation Carl had, talking to what he thought was his father's corpse, that revealed how much weight the boy had been carrying and how little room he'd been given to put it down. Chandler Riggs was 14 for most of that season's production, and he was doing work in those episodes that most adult actors couldn't have managed. But in the spring of 2014, with Season 4 ending on a cliffhanger in a train car at a place called Tuamihnos, all of that was still intact. The show was growing. The story felt like it was building somewhere, and in October of 2014 it arrived. October 12th, 2014, Sunday night, AMC, the Season 5 premiere of The Walking Dead, an episode called No Sanctuary. 17.29 million viewers. Let me just leave that number there for a moment before we talk about what surrounded it. 17.29 million people watching the same show on the same night is a number that belongs to a different era of television. The era of appointment viewing, of water cooler conversations on Monday morning, of a culture that still did a significant proportion of its entertainment consumption in synchrony rather than on demand. By 2014, that era was already fading. Streaming was becoming normal, cord cutting was accelerating. The idea that a cable drama could draw broadcast numbers was already unusual. The idea that a cable drama could draw those specific numbers, larger than anything the broadcast networks were regularly achieving, larger than any scripted program in cable history, was actually extraordinary. The record stood. Nothing has beaten it since. No Sanctuary resolved the Tuamihnos cliffhanger by immediately and thoroughly dismantling Tuamihnos. The Terminians, the cannibals, the people who had been luring survivors to their compound and killing them, had Rick and his group trapped in a train car. The episode opened with Gareth and the other Terminus survivors trapped in a train car, and Rick later manufactured improvised weapons from a belt buckle, a zipper, earrings, and Herschel's pocket watch chain. And then Carol, who was approaching Terminus from outside after leaving Tyrese and baby Judith behind, detonated a gas tank using a rifle shot and a firework. The ensuing chaos was spectacular in the most literal sense. The prison gate had been a battle. This was a demolition. Rick and the group fought their way out. The compound burned, the Terminians died or scattered, and in the rubble of the final confrontation, the show managed to do something slightly unexpected. It made Gareth, the Terminians' leader, something close to understandable. Not sympathetic exactly, but human. You got a sense of how they'd become what they became. The show was still doing the thing it had always been best at, making monsters out of people rather than out of the dead. The season that followed maintained that standard with remarkable consistency. Beth's death in Coda, the mid-season finale, was abrupt and senseless, and happened because it was abrupt and senseless. A miscommunication, a reflexive action, a gun going off at the wrong moment. It divided the audience. Some felt it was the show demonstrating that deaths here don't always come with meaning attached. Others felt it was an act of narrative carelessness. I'm somewhere in the middle, personally. The manner of it was right. The placement of it, directly after a rescue that had been building for half a season, landed with a cruelty that felt intended to wound rather than illuminate. But Emily Kinney's performance across those episodes earned the grief the death generated, and that matters. Noah's death in Spend, the revolving door sequence, which remains one of the most viscerally upsetting moments in the show's run, was something else entirely. It was constructed with a kind of horrible precision. The revolving door mechanism, the walkers pressing in from outside, the confined space, Glenn unable to reach him in time. There's an image from that sequence that I suspect a lot of you have carried around for years, even if you'd rather not. Glenn's face through the glass. That's the kind of television The Walking Dead was capable of at its best, making you feel the specific horror of helplessness. Morgan's return in Conquer, the 16th episode of Season 5, was one of the show's finest hour-long storytelling achievements. A single episode, almost entirely contained, following Morgan's journey from the broken man of Clear to someone who had found something to hold on to. Eastman, the character he encounters, a forensic psychiatrist who has survived alone on a farm and has come to a philosophy of life that refuses to accommodate killing, was played by John Carroll Lynch, and the Morgan and Eastman dynamic was handled with the kind of unhurried care that the best episodes of The Walking Dead always had. The Alexandria safe zone arrived in the second half of the season, and with it, a central question the show had been circling for 4 years. Can these people be civilized again? Can they live behind walls, among strangers who haven't been through what they've been through, who still have the luxury of being soft? Rick's famous scene at the town meeting, blood on his face from a fight, voice raised, making an argument about survival to people who haven't had to fight for theirs yet, was a peak Andrew Lincoln performance, and also the clearest statement of what the show had been building toward thematically. The idea that survival and civilization are not the same project, and that the gap between them is where most of the moral weight lives. Season 5 averaged 14.38 million viewers, the most watched show on cable television by a considerable margin. There's more to say about specific Season 5 moments, because the season had a particular texture that rewarded attention. The hospital arc, Beth captured by police officers running an Atlanta hospital as a kind of forced labour scheme, was one of the show's more interesting mid-season digressions, and it worked in a specific way that the show didn't always achieve. It introduced a community whose moral framework was internally consistent, even while being clearly wrong. The police officers running Grady Memorial Hospital were not monsters. They were people who had developed a system that worked for them and were enforcing it the way any bureaucracy enforces its rules, without much individual reflection on whether the rules were just. The parallels to pre-collapse institutions were not subtle. The show wasn't trying to be subtle. It was trying to make a point about how quickly "this is just how things work here" becomes the answer to every ethical question. Father Gabriel, introduced in Season 5 as the priest who had sealed his parishioners outside his church during the collapse and watched them die, was a fascinating addition to the ensemble. Seth Gilliam played him with a kind of flinching guilt that never became self-pity, and his arc across Season 5 and beyond, the man who did the worst thing he could imagine himself doing and had to find a way to go on living, was handled with more nuance than the show often managed with its moral complications. The Alexandria arc that closed the season had a specific dynamic worth noting. The people of Alexandria, who had survived behind walls, who had maintained something close to normal life, who had not had to do the things Rick's group had done to stay alive, were not villains. They were just soft. They had been protected from the cost of the world for long enough that they'd forgotten there was a cost. And Rick's group arrived and found them and understood immediately that Alexandria's walls, however well-intentioned, were not a solution. They were a delay. That tension between the hardened survivors who knew what the world was and the protected community that believed it wasn't quite that bad was the season's thematic engine. The show resolved it, at least provisionally, in the penultimate episode's town meeting, with Rick's bloodied face and his raised voice, and the argument he made that the people of Alexandria needed to learn, faster than they wanted to, what surviving actually required. It was the best argument the show ever made for why kindness and innocence, however valuable, were not sufficient. You needed more. And the season made that argument through specific scenes with specific characters rather than through statement, which is the only way an argument like that works in drama. Which is a long way of saying Season 5 was good. It was consistently, carefully, ambitiously good. And 17 million people knew it. 17 million people watched the Season 5 premiere. There's something that matters about what it feels like to watch a show at that moment. The moment of absolute cultural peak. There's a particular quality to the collective experience of it. The anticipation on Sunday evenings. The conversations that happened while it was still airing. The sense that the story was going somewhere. That the people making it knew where, and that they were taking you there deliberately. The audience had given the show a great deal of trust over 5 years. In Season 5, the show was still broadly honouring that trust. The decline didn't arrive all at once. It never does. And Season 6 is where you can first see it coming, if you know where to look. Season 6 began in October 2015 with numbers that would, in almost any other context, represent the peak of a show's success. Around 13.15 million average viewers for the season. The most watched scripted show on cable television, still by some margin. On any objective measure, The Walking Dead was at the height of its commercial power. And yet Season 6 is where something began to go wrong. Not dramatically, not in a way that was immediately legible from the outside, but in a way that, if you were paying close attention to how the show was treating its audience, you could feel. The season opened with an ambitious extended 90-minute premiere. The massive quarry of walkers that had been hemmed in outside Alexandria and the operation to lead them away. 100,000 walkers, give or take, following a convoy of vehicles along planned routes while the Alexandrians maintained the plan. It was the show operating at scale, and the scale was impressive. But scale is not the same as intimacy, and it was the intimacy that the show had always relied on for its emotional centre. The Wolves subplot, a group of feral, philosophy-driven killers who attacked Alexandria, was introduced and more or less resolved within a handful of episodes, which gave it the feeling of a setup for something that never fully arrived. They were interesting conceptually, the Wolves. The idea of people who had responded to the collapse by embracing chaos as a kind of religion, by abandoning the project of rebuilding anything and simply moving through the world, destroying. but they were dispatched before they could develop into anything as compelling as the governor had been, or as the saviours would theoretically become. The saviours, of course, were what Season 6 was building toward. Negan and his people had been established in the comics as the most significant threat the survivors had yet faced, not because of numbers or weapons, but because of organisation. The saviours operated as an extortion economy. They found communities of survivors and imposed taxation by force. Give us half of everything, or we'll kill you. The logic of this in a post-apocalyptic world is grimly coherent. When there's no law, there's only power. Negan had consolidated power and was using it with a systematic ruthlessness that made the governor look almost improvised. The show began introducing the saviours in the back half of Season 6, building a sense of encirclement. Every time the group tried to move through the world, they encountered another saviour roadblock. Another group of armed men, another reminder that the world outside Alexandria was no longer available to them in the way they'd assumed. The construction of that dread worked. The audience knew Negan was coming. The comics readers knew what was waiting. Everyone was watching through narrowed eyes, but before any of that, there was the dumpster. In Thank You, the third episode of the season, Glenn and Nicholas were cornered on top of a dumpster, surrounded by walkers. Nicholas, overwhelmed, shot himself. He and Glenn fell into the herd. The camera showed what appeared to be Glenn being devoured, except he wasn't. The intestines being pulled out were Nicholas's. Glenn had fallen beneath him and crawled under the dumpster and survived. He reappeared 3 episodes later in Heads Up, alive, and the show presented this as a revelation. I think it's worth talking about this in truth, because the dumpster sequence tells you something specific about where the show's creative compass was pointing in Season 6. The scene as aired was constructed to make the audience believe Glenn was dead. It used the visual grammar of the show's established death sequences, the point of view, the editing, the sound design, to create that impression deliberately. Then it waited 4 episodes, 4 weeks of audience grief and speculation, to reveal that it had been a fake out. And it presented this as a triumphant twist. What it was, actually, was the first significant moment when the show used the audience's emotional investment as a resource to be managed rather than a trust to be honoured. Glenn's death, when it came, would matter enormously to people precisely because they'd been invested in him since the first episode. The show knew that, and in the dumpster sequence, it effectively withdrew a death it hadn't made, kept the emotional credit it had generated from the withdrawal, and then held that credit for later. It's a financial metaphor, and the financial metaphor is intentional. This was a transaction, not a story decision. A lot of viewers felt this instinctively, even if they couldn't articulate exactly why the Glenn fake-out bothered them in a way that genuine character deaths hadn't. The show had always been capable of hurting you. This felt different. This felt like the show borrowing against its own integrity. Then came Last Day on Earth, the Season 6 finale. 90 minutes of the group getting stopped on the road, roadblocks appearing, every route closing off, a net drawing tighter. Negan emerged. He made his speech. He selected someone with eeny, meeny, miny, mo. He swung the bat, and the screen went black, and the episode ended. 7 months of speculation followed. The internet produced extensive forensic analysis of every frame of the episode, trying to identify the victim. It became, in the worst possible way, a cultural conversation, not about the story, but about a puzzle the show had constructed and hidden the solution to. The audience didn't receive this well. Not all of it. There was a vocal and substantial segment of the viewership that felt not cliffhangers excited, but manipulated frustrated. The distinction matters. A good cliffhanger makes you desperate to see what comes next because the story has pulled you to a point of genuine tension. This cliffhanger asked you to care intensely about something the show had deliberately made impossible to think about clearly. It wasn't tension, it was suspension. There's something specific to say about what the Season 6 finale did to the show's relationship with its own mythology. which is that it revealed the show had started thinking about its audience as a resource to be managed rather than a community to be served. The reasoning behind the cliffhanger was not mysterious. The producers wanted to generate a mid-season conversation about The Walking Dead that would sustain interest over the summer hiatus. That's a reasonable commercial objective, but achieving it by withholding information from an audience that had trusted the show with their emotional investment for 6 years was a different transaction than the one the show had built its success on. The audience had given the show something over 6 years that was real and worth protecting. The willingness to be hurt. To invest in characters knowing those characters could be taken away. To let the deaths matter. To let the fear matter. To watch without the emotional armour that most genre entertainment encourages you to maintain. That willingness was the show's most important asset, and it had been built through years of the show demonstrating that it would use it in truth, that the hurt would come from the story rather than from a game. The dumpster, fake out, and the cliffhanger, taken together, signalled something. They told the audience that the show was willing to use their emotional investment tactically as a mechanism for generating attention, rather than honouring it as a covenant. Most individual viewers couldn't articulate that in those terms, but they felt it. The feeling is what the declining Season 7 engagement reflected. When Season 7 arrived with the answer, the audience was there. Just over 17 million for the premiere, but something had already been spent that couldn't be earned back. The Day Will Come When You Won't Be aired on October 23, 2016. Season 7, Episode 1. And it drew 17.03 million viewers, the second highest single episode audience in the show's history. Those numbers say one thing. The episode itself said something more complicated. Jeffrey Dean Morgan had been cast as Negan, and his performance from the first moment is committed in a way you can't argue with. I find myself thinking, even now, that Morgan was never quite given the material his performance deserved. He understood the character more completely than the writing consistently supported. The character, as written for television, was theatrical in a very specific way. The leather jacket, Lucille, the performance of absolute confidence, the speeches delivered with the cadence of someone who has had a long time to practice his own mythology. Morgan understood that the key to Negan was not to play the violence, but to play the ease. The ease of a man for whom this is simply Tuesday. The ease of someone who actually does not understand why you're still fighting when the mathematics of power make the outcome so clear. That's a compelling performance choice, and Morgan executed it well. The episode revealed the victims of the Season 6 cliffhanger. Abraham Ford, beaten to death with Lucille. Then Glenn Urry, in a sequence that included an image I won't describe in detail because we're supposed to be winding down here, but which was, by any measure, extremely graphic. Beaten to death with the same bat. Stephen Yeun had been with the show since the very first season. Glenn's arc is across 6 years, from the nervous, quick-talking supply runner in Atlanta to the man who had built a marriage and a life in the ruins of the world, who had always been, in some fundamental way, the show's optimist, was one of the more quietly beautiful character journeys the series had produced. His death was always going to be devastating. His death in the comic had been devastating. In the television adaptation, the staging and execution of it generated a reaction in the audience that went well beyond conventional television grief. The Parents Television Council filed a formal complaint about the episode's violence. Major television critics wrote specifically about the scene. Viewers who had watched horror programming for years described finding it actually difficult. And the following episode, The Well, set at the kingdom introducing Ezekiel, a former zookeeper who had built a community around a theatre of benevolent kingship, drew 12.46 million viewers. That's a drop of more than 4.5 million viewers in a single week. Compare it to what had happened after the Season 5 premiere. The record-setting No Sanctuary audience dropped to 15.14 million for Strangers, a loss of about 2 million. which is normal. Premiere audiences always inflate above average, and the second episode is usually the truer indicator. But a drop of 2 million is very different from a drop of nearly 5 million, and it happened after a single episode. The show never recovered those numbers. Not in season 7, not ever again. And here's what I find interesting in a real sense about that. From a storytelling perspective, the premise of season 7 was, Negan has won. Rick has been broken. The group is scattered across multiple communities, each one submitting to savior rule in different ways, each one finding its own forms of resistance. The season explored the psychology of subjugation. What does compliance cost? What does resistance cost? How do communities organize when the organization itself is under surveillance? These are interesting questions. The problem was the way the season answered them, which was very slowly across a large number of episodes, with Rick's submission framed in a way that was tonally difficult to spend time with. Andrew Lincoln was giving everything the role asked for: the submission, the fear, the gradual rebuilding of will. But Rick Grimes as a broken deferential figure was simply hard to watch for the better part of a season. The show had built Rick as someone who acted. Watching him not act, week after week, tested the patience of an audience that had already spent 7 months being tested by the cliffhanger. Season 7 averaged 11.35 million viewers, down from 13. The trajectory was clear. Season 8, the all-out war arc, drew 11.4 million for its premiere and then never exceeded 10 million again for the rest of its run. The war itself, which had been building for 2 seasons, was spread across 16 episodes in a way that made the momentum collapse. The same locations, the same confrontations, the same cycle of setbacks and rallies. What should have been a sustained building conflict became a kind of exhausting repetition. The show averaged 7.82 million viewers in season 8, a 30% decline from season 7, which had itself been a decline. The mathematics were doing something the show couldn't reverse by storytelling alone. There were individual episodes in season 8 that were very good, the key, dead or alive, or moments that reminded you what the show was capable of. But the arc as a whole had a fundamental structural problem, which was that all-out war needed to feel like it was heading somewhere definitive, and the show kept pulling back from definitiveness in service of keeping the story going. The audience was running out of patience with a story that wouldn't commit to its own conclusions. Season 8 did something else that gets overlooked, which is that it produced one of the show's more interesting supporting character arcs in the figure of Sudik, the stranger Carl risked his life to save, who became a doctor within the Alexandria community and carried the weight of what his rescue had cost for years afterwards. That storyline, spread across multiple seasons, was handled quietly and carefully by Avi Nash, and it's the kind of thing that the show at its best was always doing alongside the main narrative, giving secondary characters enough room to be real. The all-out war arc's structural failure was, in retrospect, partly a function of what it was trying to do, and partly a function of the network economics of a 16-episode season. A story about a protracted military conflict needs either genuine uncertainty about the outcome or genuine cost in the getting there. Season 8 had neither, quite. The outcome was never in serious doubt. The costs, and there were costs, Sasha's death in the season 7 finale, the losses along the way, were processed too quickly to accumulate. The audience had been patient through 2 seasons of build-up and found the payoff unsatisfying, which is one of the more dispiriting things that can happen to a long investment of time and feeling. And then came 2 decisions, made in fairly quick succession, that changed the show in ways it would never fully recover from. Let's talk about Carl Grimes. Carl is, in Robert Kirkman's comic, the most important character in the story. Not always the most central. In any given arc, Rick is the driver for most of the narrative, but the most important in terms of what the story is actually about. Because The Walking Dead, at its core, is a story about inheritance, about what the old world passes to the new one, about whether the worst of what humanity is capable of becomes the new normal, or whether it's possible to build something better out of the wreckage. Carl is the embodiment of that question. He's the child of the collapse. He has no adult memory of the world before. Everything he knows in the context of the dead walking and the living fighting. What kind of person does that make him? And does that person represent hope or its absence? Kirkman was explicit about this. He described Carl in interviews over the years as the heart of the series. In the comic, Carl survives. He grows up. In the comic's final arc, it's Rick's death and legacy that build the peace that he worked toward, which Carl then helps to preserve. It's Carl who inherits the world. Chandler Riggs had been playing Carl on the television series since he was 9 years old. He grew up in the role, quite literally. The Carl of Season 1 is a frightened child following a parent through disaster. The Carl of Season 5 is a teenager who is killed, who has made impossible decisions, who is beginning to grapple with what he's become and what he wants to become. The Carl of Season 8, before the decision was made, was positioned to become one of the show's most compelling characters in its next phase. A young adult who remembered nothing of the before and was trying to build something anyway. The decision to kill Carl was made, by most accounts, for reasons that had little to do with storytelling. Reports at the time pointed toward a contract dispute with Chandler Riggs, though the full details were never publicly confirmed. Riggs's father posted on Facebook shortly after the news of Carl's death became public, a message that implied his son had been told the show would continue for several more years, only to be written out without the advance notice that would have allowed him to pursue other opportunities. The post was later deleted. Gimple's response was that the character's death served the story, that it set Rick toward a mercy arc with Negan that the show needed at that point in its narrative. Carl's fatal bite was revealed in the Season 8 mid-season episode How It's Gotta Be in late 2017. The cause was a walker bite, sustained off-screen during a previous episode. Carl spent his final episode saying goodbye to the people he loved, leaving a letter for his father, a letter for Negan, dying the way the show allowed him to die, with dignity and intention, in contrast to the sudden, senseless way so many others had gone. Kirkman's response when asked about it was measured and somewhat pained. He said that he still believed Carl was the heart of the story. He said the death had been handled as well as it could have been handled. He was noticeably not enthusiastic. What the show lost when it killed Carl is hard to fully quantify because it's a counterfactual. You can't know what Carl would have become, but you can know what the show had always been building. Kirkman's arc was always about a father trying to preserve something worth inheriting for a son who would actually do the inheriting. With Carl gone, the inheritance question became almost unanswerable. Rick was no longer fighting for anything that had a face and a name. He was fighting for an abstraction, a future, something better, and abstractions are hard to generate the same investment in. The audience reaction was large and specific, and sustained in a way that distinguished it from the normal grief of losing a beloved character. Fans who had accepted previous deaths as part of the show's contract with reality found this one different. Not because Carl was killed, but because the manner and reasoning of his death felt institutional rather than narrative. It felt like a decision made outside the story rather than inside it. And that distinction between deaths that serve the story and deaths that serve the production was one the show's audience had always been attuned to. The show continued without Carl. It continued actually, very soon, without its other central figure as well. And between the two departures, the show lost something it couldn't rebuild its way out of. It's worth spending a moment with what Carl's final episode actually was, because it was, despite the circumstances of the decision around it, made with genuine care. Honor, the Season 8 mid-season episode in which Carl died, was given an extended 82 minutes. His final hours were structured around a series of conversations with Daryl, with Sadiq, with Judith, with Michonne, and ultimately with Rick. Each conversation served a different purpose. The Daryl conversation was about forgiveness, Carl having been the one to press for mercy toward the saviors that Daryl had resisted. The Sadiq conversation was about the principle that had cost Carl his life. He'd been bitten saving Sadiq, a stranger, because he believed the world they were trying to build required the preservation of strangers. The Judith conversation was the saddest, because Judith was too young to fully understand, and Carl knew it. The Rick conversation was the one the whole series had been building toward in some ways. A father being told by his dying son what kind of world was worth fighting for. Chandler Riggs was 19 at the time of filming. He was acting opposite Andrew Lincoln, who has never been better than he is in the scenes where Rick understands what is happening to his son. The episode was directed by Greg Nicotero, who brought to it the same care he'd always brought to the show's most significant sequences. The final image of Carl, Rick carrying him out into the sunlight, the light almost gentle, the world quiet for once, was composed with real tenderness. None of this resolves the question of whether the decision was right. It doesn't. The episode being well made is entirely separate from the decision to make it being wrong, and both things can be true. What it does suggest is that the people making the show understood what they were losing, even if the circumstances that produced the decision were outside the story's internal logic. They grieved Carl too. The care is visible in the work. What followed in the second half of Season 8, Rick's attempt to build the mercy over victory conclusion that Carl had asked for, the final confrontation with Negan, the decision to spare him, should have been the show's most emotionally resonant arc. It had been built carefully, it had the weight of Carl's death behind it, and it was received, by much of the remaining audience, as underwhelming. Not because it was badly executed, but because the season as a whole had worn out so much goodwill that the emotional landing the final episodes asked for could no longer be sustained. The architecture was right, the foundation was gone. Andrew Lincoln left The Walking Dead in Season 9. He was clear about the reason. He wanted to be in England with his family. Which honestly, and I say this as someone who finds it hard to imagine the show without him, is a completely fair reason. A decade is a very long time to be away from home. His children were growing up in London, and he'd spent the better part of a decade in Georgia, returning home between shoots, and the logistics of that life had become something he wasn't willing to sustain indefinitely. By every account, the decision was actually personal, and not in any way a reflection of dissatisfaction with the show or his colleagues. He loved the role. He left anyway, because a decade is a long time. The show's response to this was to do something quite careful and quite strange. Season 9 opened with Angela Kang as the new showrunner. Kang had been a writer and producer on the show for years, and her promotion brought with it a creative recalibration that was immediately visible. The premiere episode of Season 9 had a different quality to it. The time jump, moving the story forward about a year and a half from where Season 8 had ended, gave Kang space to begin again from a slightly fresher vantage point, and she used it well. The communities were trying to build something together. The tone was cautious but not hopeless. Characters who had been sidelined during the war arc were given room to be people again. Rick's final arc involved a bridge, a literal bridge, being constructed across a river by the combined communities as a symbol of cooperation and a practical piece of infrastructure. The metaphor was not subtle, but it didn't need to be. The construction of the bridge as Rick's last meaningful act, his gift to the future he'd been fighting for, gave his departure a shape and a purpose that Carl's death had lacked. In What Comes After, the 5th episode of Season 9, a herd of walkers stampeded toward the worksite. Rick led them onto the bridge. He saw his family watching from the far bank. He fired at an abandoned dynamite cache on the bridge, and the bridge exploded, and Rick Grimes appeared to die in the blast, except he didn't. A helicopter a CRM helicopter, marked with the 3-ring symbol that had been appearing in background details for 2 seasons, arrived, and the pilot was Anne, who had been part of the Scavengers, and who had a history with the CRM that the show had been seeding quietly. She landed. She retrieved Rick, alive but unconscious. The helicopter left. The people watching from the bank believed Rick was dead. Andrew Lincoln would return to the role in The Ones Who Live, a limited series spin-off, in 2024. So Rick didn't die. He was just removed from the story for about 4 years. The Walking Dead movies that AMC announced around the time of Lincoln's departure, theatrical films that would continue Rick's story, never materialized as films. Production was announced, then indefinitely delayed, then quietly transformed into the limited series format. The path from Rick's story continues in cinemas to Rick's story continues in a 6-episode streaming series is a long one, and the journey along it tells its own story about the franchise's changing fortunes. But The Ones Who Live was ultimately very good, and we'll get to it. The Season 9 premiere drew 6.1 million viewers. For comparison, the Season 8 premiere had drawn 11.4 million. Nearly half the audience had left between one season and the next. The trajectory was no longer gradual, it had become steep. And yet Season 9, under Kang's guidance, was critically better than anything the show had produced in 2 or 3 seasons. The time jump after Rick's departure was handled smartly. A further 6-year jump that transformed the surviving communities, aged up the younger characters, and introduced a new generation of survivors who had actually grown up in the post-apocalyptic world. Judith Grimes, at 10 years old, carrying her father's gun and his hat, and her grandfather Morgan's compass, was handled with something approaching genuine care. The Whisperers arrived in the second half of the season, and the Whisperers were the best villain concept the show had introduced since The Governor. So we find ourselves in this slightly strange position where the show was making better television and drawing fewer viewers, and the two facts were related only indirectly. The audience that had left during Seasons 7 and 8 hadn't left because the show was bad. They'd left because the show had broken their trust in specific ways, and rebuilding trust is much harder than losing it. The improved quality of Season 9 couldn't undo the memories of the Season 6 cliffhanger and the Season 7 premiere and the Season 8 exhaustion. The people who had stayed were engaged. The people who had left were not being drawn back by critical reviews. Kang had been given a better show to run than her predecessors had left her. The tragedy is that she was running it for a much smaller audience than the story deserved. Let me stay with Season 9 for a moment, because some of it was quite excellent, and it doesn't get enough attention under the shadow of the viewership decline. The episode Stradivarius, midway through Season 9, was a small-scale character study following Daryl in his self-imposed exile from the communities, living alone in the woods, keeping company with a dog, apparently content to have removed himself from everything. Carol came to find him. The conversation they had in a run-down campsite in the woods about what exile costs and what it offers, and whether the distance from other people is a choice or a surrender, was one of the most honest things the show had written about these two characters in years. Reedus and McBride had spent a decade doing the quiet work of this friendship, and here the show finally slowed down enough to let the work show. The Whisperer introduction at the end of Season 9 was handled with deliberate restraint. The reveal of what the Whisperers actually were, the moment when Daryl, Jesus, and Aaron encountered a walker that responded differently, that spoke, that turned and had a human face behind dead skin, was staged with the kind of careful horror the show had been so good at in its earliest seasons. No spectacle, just a moment that was wrong, and the recognition of it, and the implications spreading out from that recognition. Samantha Morton joined the show in the second half of Season 9, and her impact was immediate. Alpha's introduction was staged simply. She walked out of the trees, she spoke to Daryl. She made no threats because threats would have been unnecessary. The threat was her stillness. The threat was the absolute absence of anything to read on her face. That's a complicated thing to play in a medium where readability is usually the goal, and Morton found a way to communicate enormous interior life while presenting an exterior that appeared to have none. The episode Omega, which was Season 9's 10th episode and first delved deeply into Alpha's backstory, showing what it had cost her and what she'd made her daughter Lydia become, was shot in a style unlike anything else in the show's run. Extended flashbacks, deliberately washed-out colour palette, Morton's performance in an earlier version of the character who was clearly becoming something but hadn't finished becoming it yet. It was the kind of episode that reminded you what good casting could do for a franchise that had been running on momentum and needed an infusion of something new. The quality was there. The audience gap between the quality and the viewership was not the fault of Season 9's creative team. It was the accumulated cost of earlier decisions, playing out in the numbers long after the decisions themselves had been made. That's not a comforting dynamic, but it's an honest one. The Whisperers are, as a concept, one of the most disturbing things Robert Kirkman ever put in the comic, which is saying something given the competition. I find the Whisperers more unsettling than Negan actually, and I've thought about why. It's because Negan is still recognisably human in his monstrousness. He has a philosophy, a charisma, a code. The Whisperers have abandoned the project of being human. That's a different kind of threat. They are people who have decided that the best way to survive the apocalypse is not to fight the dead or build walls against them, but to join them, to move among the walker herds. As walkers, wearing the dried skins of the dead over their faces, walking in the same shuffling pattern, making the same sounds, hiding in the herd until they need to emerge from it. They have abandoned language, largely. They whisper when they speak, because volume attracts the dead, and they have been living in silence for so long that the whisper is all they have. They have a philosophy too, and it's a dark one. The Whisperers believed that civilization was a failed experiment, that the world the walkers inherited is the natural state of things, predator and prey, strong and weak, no pretense. Alpha, their leader, has taken this philosophy to its logical conclusion. She has made herself utterly without sentiment. She has no name from before. She has no connections she would die to protect. She has cut everything away that would make her vulnerable. And then Samantha Morton arrived to play Alpha, and the performance was extraordinary. Morton is a British actress who has spent 30 years making uncommonly precise and unsettling choices, and Alpha gave her scope to do something specific and unsettling. The character was still, almost completely still most of the time. Where other antagonists on the show projected threat through aggression or theatrics, the Governor's controlled charm, Negan's performed enthusiasm, Morton's Alpha projected it through absence, through the removal of everything recognisably human. There was a particular way she held her face, a particular flatness in the eyes that communicated immense violence at rest. The violence was never far away, it just wasn't visible until it arrived. Ryan Hurst played Beta, Alpha's second in command, with an enormous physical presence and a psychological complexity that the character deserved. Beta in the comic was interesting in a general way. On screen, Hurst gave him a specific interior life, the devotion, the rage at anything that threatened the hierarchy he'd committed to, that made him feel dangerous, in a different register than Alpha. The Whisperer storyline's defining moment was the Pike scene, in Season 9's penultimate episode, The Calm Before, and in flashbacks during the opening of Season 10. Characters who had been with the show for years, Henry, Enid, Tara, others, were killed in The Calm Before, their heads placed on pikes marking the Whisperer's border. The reveal of the pike line was staged with restraint, each head appearing in the torchlight one by one, the faces of people the audience had known for years. It was the most devastating ensemble loss since the Season 4 prison attack, and it worked, specifically because Season 9 had rebuilt the emotional infrastructure that the previous seasons had allowed to deteriorate. Kang and her writers had spent half a season reminding you why you cared about these people before they took them away. That's the craft. That's the thing the show had been most reliably good at in its early years, and had most reliably failed at in its middle years. Season 10 carried the Whisperer conflict forward with genuine quality. The episode, Here's Negan, which gave Jeffrey Dean Morgan's character a full backstory, exploring who Negan was before the collapse, and, in its immediate aftermath, the love story with Lucille, the original Lucille, his wife, was among the finest single hours the show produced in its final 3 seasons. Morgan had always been doing the work. Now the show was finally meeting him where he was. The season 10 finale was delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The episode had been filmed and was ready to air, but the post-production on the final visual effects wasn't completed because the facilities shut down. So the season ended on its penultimate episode, and the finale aired more than 6 months later, in October 2020. It was an unusual ending to an unusual production period, and it generated an unusual response. The additional weight somehow didn't dissipate anticipation the way an ordinary delay might have, perhaps because the audience had been watching very little else for 6 months and was grateful for anything. AMC subsequently commissioned 6 additional episodes for season 10, made with reduced budgets and reduced casts, largely as anthology pieces. They were, on balance, better than they had any right to be. The episode One More, following Gabriel and Aaron on a supply run that went very wrong, was tense and clever. The episode Find Me, which gave Daryl and Carol's friendship its longest single examination, was quieter and more emotionally honest than the show usually managed. Season 10 averaged around 2.8 to 3 million viewers, depending on the episode. The critical conversation around the show had recovered. The audience had not. Those are 2 different things, and they don't resolve into one another just because one changes. There's a slightly melancholy quality to watching season 10, with that knowledge in the back of your head. You're watching a creative team doing genuinely good work for an audience that has already made up its mind, and there's nothing the work can do to change that. The audience that left after seasons 7 and 8 was not watching to find out if the show had improved. They'd already had their answer. The bottle episode, What We Become, gave Danai Gurira one of her finest Michonne moments before she left the show, a drug-induced sequence that imagined the alternative timeline of a Michonne who had made different choices, played with a commitment and a visual boldness the show hadn't attempted in years. It felt like the show doing something for itself, for the audience that had stayed, rather than for the numbers. Look at the Flowers, the episode that followed the Alpha Arc's conclusion, gave Carol a long, quiet reckoning with what the violence had cost her. McBride sat with it without resolution, which is more honest than most shows allow a character to be. There's no cathartic moment, no clarity at the end of the episode. Just a woman in the woods, carrying what she's done, keeping walking. These were not minor efforts. They were the work of a team that had found something worth saying and was saying it carefully, for whoever was still listening. The 11th and final season of The Walking Dead was structured in 3 parts of 8 episodes each, released across 15 months, from August 2021 to November 2022. The decision to extend what might have been a single, concentrated final season into a long, spread-out conclusion was made partly for production reasons, and partly, one suspects, because AMC was not in a hurry to formally end a franchise that was still generating revenue, even at reduced viewership levels. 15 months is a long time to say goodbye. The final season introduced the Commonwealth, which became the show's most ambitious world-building project since the prison. The Commonwealth was a community of about 50,000 people, not a few dozen survivors behind a fence, but a genuine city with class structures and a functioning economy and a postal service and a newspaper and an ice cream parlour. It was, in other words, a version of civilization. The version that had survived was stratified and hierarchical and protected by armed enforcers, but it was recognisably a society. Pamela Milton, the Commonwealth's governor, was played by Layla Robbins with a particular kind of studied pleasantness, the pleasantness of someone who has held power long enough that it no longer occurs to her to justify it. The character worked as a villain because she wasn't monstrous. She was institutional. She was the face of a system that had decided, reasonably efficiently, who mattered and who didn't. And she maintained that system because it had worked for her, and for the people she decided mattered. Lance Hornsby, her subordinate and the season's more actively threatening antagonist, was played by Josh Hamilton with a bureaucratic menace that felt fresh. The career opportunist in the apocalypse. The man who exists in every organisation who has decided that advancement is the point of everything. The final 8 episodes of the season, which is to say the final 8 episodes of the show, were called Part 3 and aired in late 2022. Rest in Peace, the series finale, aired on November 20th, 2022. I want to talk about what the finale did well, because it's easy to let the context of the show's decline cast everything in that final period as a failure. And that's not accurate. The finale gave Daryl his road. The post-credits sequence showed him on his motorcycle, leaving the Commonwealth, heading somewhere, free in the way he'd never quite been able to be while he was tethered to the group and its responsibilities. That felt right. Daryl Dixon had always been most himself when he was moving. The spin-off that followed, sending him to France, is on some level a logical extension of that image. Maggie and Negan reach something, not forgiveness, Rahir. The show was wise enough not to ask the audience to accept Glenn's death as something that could be forgiven, but a kind of practical peace, a recognition that the world required them to coexist, and that they were both capable of operating within that constraint. What they built in the final episodes was not warmth, but something more honest. Mutual respect derived from surviving the worst thing they'd shared. Their spin-off, Dead City, proceeds from that relationship, and the relationship is rich enough to support it. Negan's arc across the final 3 seasons was, I think, the show's most successful long-form character work in its later years. The journey from the man who killed Glenn to a person who'd actually examined what he'd become, without the show asking you to forget what he'd done or pretending it could be undone, was handled with more consistency and more conviction than most of the narrative around it. The post-credits scene showed Rick Grimes, alive, on a remote shoreline in CRM territory, writing a note, and Michonne, on horseback, riding through snow and fog, searching for someone. The final scene showed walkers ahead of Michonne as she rode toward them. She did not look back. It was a graceful final image. It pointed forward, toward the ones who live, though that project wouldn't arrive for another 1.5 years, without closing anything prematurely. The dead keep walking. The living keep moving. The story isn't over. Around 227 million people watched the finale. That's the number. Measured against the Season 5 premiere, which we talked about earlier, it's an 87% decline across 8 years. Measured against anything else, any show in its final season, any network's hopes for a conclusion, it's modest. But the 1.4 million who watched included people who had been there for every season, who had been watching this story for 12 years, and for whom modest doesn't capture what the evening meant. The show deserved more. Probably, but it got an ending. That's not nothing. One thing the final season did that deserves specific mention is the way it handled Eugene Porter's storyline within the Commonwealth. Josh McDermott had been playing Eugene, the cowardly survivor who lied about having a cure in Season 4 and spent the rest of the show rebuilding something worth respecting since the very beginning of the show's Alexandria era. The Commonwealth gave Eugene a romance and a community and a reason to stay, and ultimately a choice between the safety he'd finally found and the people he'd fought alongside for years. McDermott played it without overstatement, which is exactly right for a character whose entire arc had been about doing less rather than more, about earning trust quietly rather than performing heroism. His ending was small and domestic and very happy, and the show gave it to him without apology. Ezekiel's final season arc, navigating both a cancer diagnosis and the political complexities of the Commonwealth, was another quiet success. Kari Payton had always been one of the ensemble's most consistent pleasures. The theatrical grandiosity of Ezekiel's public persona sitting on top of a fundamentally kind and frightened man. And the final season gave him material that used both registers well. The Commonwealth storyline's greatest creative risk was also its most interesting. The suggestion that post-apocalyptic society, if it survived long enough, would inevitably reproduce the structural inequalities of the world it replaced. The Commonwealth had a caste system. It had propaganda. It had a governing class that benefited from those systems and an underclass that didn't. And the show's argument that this was not an aberration, but a tendency, a gravitational pull built into human social organisation that would reassert itself given enough time and enough people, was its most ambitious political statement since the prison era. Whether the show executed that argument fully across its final season is a separate question. The fact that it made it at all, this late in its run, with this level of seriousness, says something about the creative team's commitment to the story, even when the industrial context around them was contracting. The Walking Dead franchise, as it currently exists, is a sprawling thing. It has tentacles going in multiple directions, at different quality levels, with different degrees of creative investment behind them. And since we've come this far, it seems worth spending some time with all of them because, between the spin-offs and the parent show, this universe has produced somewhere north of 300 hours of television, and some of those hours are much better than others. Before diving into the individual shows, there's a broader question the spin-offs raise that's worth sitting with. What is a franchise for? The cynical answer is that it's a mechanism for extending the commercial life of intellectual property beyond the natural end of its original story. The more generous answer is that it's an acknowledgement that a well-built world contains more stories than one show can tell. Both answers are correct about the Walking Dead spin-off universe, in different proportions depending on which spin-off you're talking about. The franchise also functions as an employment ecosystem. The Walking Dead's production infrastructure, the Georgia studios, the effects teams, the behind-the-scenes crews who've been working in this universe for over a decade, represents a substantial investment that doesn't dissolve just because the main show ended. The spin-offs keep that infrastructure working and the people in it employed. And that's not an ignoble motivation, even if it's not a purely artistic one. What the spin-offs have in common at their best is a willingness to do things the parent show had stopped doing by its later seasons. Take the world seriously enough to ask what it would actually look like in a different place, with different people, building different things. The Walking Dead as a franchise had always been interested in community, how people build it, what costs they pay to maintain it, what it costs when it fails. The spin-offs, by moving the story to new locations and new characters, got to ask those questions without the accumulated weight of 11 seasons of established expectations. Fear the Walking Dead is the oldest spin-off, debuting in 2015, while the parent show was still at peak viewership. The concept was appealing. A story set on the West Coast during the initial outbreak, following a blended family navigating the collapse in real time. Where The Walking Dead dropped us into a world already over, Fear would show the before, the last days of ordinary life, the denial, the recognition, the surrender to what the world had become. The pilot had a particular quality to it, a domestic naturalism that felt right for the material. Fear ran for 8 seasons, ending in 2023. That's a lot of television for a spin-off that was frequently described, especially in its middle seasons, as the weakest entry in the franchise. And yet Fear had specific periods of genuine excellence that deserve acknowledgement. The second season, set largely at sea on a boat sailing down the Pacific coast toward Mexico, was inventive and strange in ways the show had stopped being on dry land. The boat sequences, the specific isolation of a ship full of frightened people with nowhere to go, were the spin-off's best sustained creative work. Victor Strand, played by Coleman Domingo with full commitment from the first episode, was consistently one of the franchise's most interesting characters. Coleman Domingo is worth a note, actually. He was an established and well-regarded theatre and film actor when he took the role, and his trajectory since. An Oscar nomination, a Best Actor nomination at the Screen Actors Guild, widespread recognition as one of the finest performers of his generation, is a nice reminder that the Walking Dead universe was, at various points, a very good place for serious actors to do serious work. Fear's later seasons drifted toward the mythology-heavy and the tonal inconsistency that plague long-running genre shows, and the final seasons received reviews that were somewhere between mixed and unkind. But it ran 8 seasons, which is more than most shows manage, and it contained work that the broader franchise should be proud of. The Walking Dead World Beyond ran for 2 seasons, 2020 and 2021, and was perhaps the most deliberate entry in the franchise. It was designed as a limited series, 2 seasons, a complete story, a conclusion. The story followed the first generation of teenagers who had grown up entirely within the post-apocalyptic world, attending school in a protected community and then venturing out for the first time. The concept was interesting. The execution, in the view of most critics and viewers, was less compelling. The show ended after its 2nd season as a planned limited series, which had always been the plan, but still felt like a statement. The post-credits scene of the finale was more talked about than anything in the show itself, connecting the C.R.M. mythology to the broader universe in ways that pointed toward Rick's story. The Walking Dead Dead City premiered in June 2023, following Maggie and Negan into Manhattan, which had become an island overrun with the dead following the destruction of the bridges and tunnels connecting it to the mainland. The conceit, these 2 people who can barely stand each other, forced to navigate a specific and bizarre version of hell together, worked better than it had any right to. Lauren Cohan and Jeffrey Dean Morgan have a chemical dynamic that generates watchable tension without effort, and the New York location gave the show a visual distinctiveness that separated it clearly from the parent. Manhattan full of walkers, skyscrapers still standing but dark and crumbling, the Hudson lapping at ruined docks. It looked like nothing else in the franchise. The Walking Dead Daryl Dixon sent Norman Reedus to France, which is the kind of sentence that requires a moment's adjustment. Daryl ends up in France. He doesn't know how. The show begins with him waking up on the coast of Normandy with no clear memory of how he crossed an ocean. It sounds like the premise of a comedy, and at moments it nearly was, but Reedus is committed enough to carry the fish out of water premise through the absurdity into something that functioned quite well on its own terms. France itself was used beautifully. The cathedrals, the country roads, the specific texture of a European post-apocalypse that felt different in ways that mattered from the American versions. The show's 2nd season, subtitled The Book of Carol, brought back Melissa McBride's Carol and the Daryl Carol dynamic that had always been one of the parent show's deepest emotional through lines finally got the room to breathe that 11 seasons had never quite provided. And then there's The Ones Who Live, Rick Grimes and Michonne. 6 episodes. The Ones Who Live aired on AMC and AMC+. Andrew Lincoln and Danai Gurira, both back, giving performances that reminded you what the show had once been capable of. The story took the C.R.M. mythology and made it into something coherent. A fascist military organisation building a new world through violence and control, and 2 people trying to find each other within the structure of it. The series was made with genuine love for the characters and a clear-eyed sense of what it owed the audience after years of delays and false starts. It earned its emotional moments because it did the work before it asked for the feeling. Lincoln's performance in it was, I think, some of the finest work he's done with the character. Rick in The Ones Who Live has been broken and rebuilt in ways that made his Season 9 departure make retroactive sense. Michonne's journey across the seasons had always been one of the show's quietest and most sustained pieces of character writing, and the series gave Guerrera a full arc that the parent show had never quite delivered. It was, in the end, a good ending for two characters who deserved one. Better late than never. There's a version of this conversation that ends with the decline as the whole story. The numbers dropping from 17 million to the audience that was left by the end. The showrunner carousel, 3 different creative visions in 3 seasons. The dumpster fake out, the cliffhanger finale, the Carl decision. The ways the show spent the trust it had built over its first 5 years. That version is accurate. It contains real things that happened, but it's not the whole story, and I don't think it's the most interesting story either. The most interesting story is what The Walking Dead built when it was building well. And what it built was remarkable in a specific way. At its peak, this was a show that demonstrated something about the limits of genre categorization that television hadn't fully demonstrated before. Zombie apocalypse programming was not, in 2010, considered a prestige form. It was considered horror. It was considered niche. It was considered, by most of the people who decide what counts as serious television, as entertainment for a specific audience, teenage boys, horror fans, comic readers, rather than for the mainstream audience, that awards and critical recognition follow. The Walking Dead changed that calculus almost immediately, and the change has been permanent. The genre drama that follows, that takes its horror premise as a vehicle for human storytelling, rather than as the point in itself, owes something to what Darabont and Kirkman established in those first seasons. The cultural footprint was real and visible. Zombie walks organised around premiere dates, the merchandise that moved not because people were casual fans, but because they had genuine attachment to specific characters. Carol's cookies, Michonne's katana, Negan's bat, the video game. The Telltale Games adaptation of The Walking Dead, which premiered in 2012 and won more Game of the Year awards than anything else that year, is built on the emotional infrastructure of Kirkman's world. And the first season of that game, the story of Lee and Clementine, is considered by many people to be among the finest narrative games ever made. That's a real cultural legacy. The television show made that game possible, and the game introduced hundreds of thousands of people to the franchise who had never watched the show. The show also changed what AMC was, which is not a small thing. The network that had been a declining classic film channel became partly on the strength of The Walking Dead's commercial success, a genuine player in prestige television. It funded the expansion of its original programming. It greenlit the shows that followed. The network that The Walking Dead built is the one that made Better Call, Saul, and Killing Eve, and Halt and Catch Fire, all of which benefited from the financial stability and creative confidence that the zombie show's enormous viewership provided. That's an indirect legacy, but it's a real one. Then there's the way the story was told at its best. The episode Clear belongs in any serious discussion of the finest single hours of American drama television. Not in the conversation, on the edge, hoping to be included, fully in it, alongside the best episodes of The Sopranos and Mad Men, and the shows that get cited reflexively. It is that good. A self-contained story about 2 men who started a journey together and found themselves at completely different places, told with patience and specificity and an emotional honesty that never crosses into sentiment. Lenny James and Andrew Lincoln in that episode gave performances that would have won awards in any prestige competition that took the genre seriously enough to enter them. Here's Not Here in Season 6, The Grove in Season 4, the episode about Carol and Lizzie at the cabin, which ended in the most devastating way the show ever found, and which established Melissa McBride as one of the finest dramatic performers working in American television. One More in Season 10. Coming Home from Daryl Dixon. These are good hours of television made by people who cared about what they were doing. The Decline tells you something real about the industry, about what happens when a show becomes a machine, when the network's financial interests and the story's creative needs stop pointing in the same direction, when showrunner changes and budget pressures, and the slow drift of an audience that has been hurt too many times accumulate into something that can't be reversed by quality alone. The Walking Dead's decline is instructive precisely because the show was so good before it started declining. You need to understand what was lost to understand what the losing of it cost. Robert Kirkman ended the comic in 2019 with no advance warning, on his own schedule, with an ending that surprised and that had been earned. The last issue was called The Farmhouse, and the story it told was quiet and conclusive, and in Kirkman's words, the story he had always been moving toward. He got to end it when he wanted to end it. That's the privilege of creator-owned material on the page, in a way that creator-owned material on television almost never has the luxury of replicating. The television show didn't get that clean an ending. 11 seasons over 12 years, spread across a landscape of changing viewership habits and franchise obligations and commercial pressures, doesn't lend itself to the kind of authorial control that produces a definitive final chapter. But it got to be something. For 5 seasons, it got to be one of the best things on television. For a few years after that, it got to be very good television with specific flaws. For the rest of it, it got to be a franchise that kept a world alive, and occasionally, in the right episode with the right writer and the right actors, reminded you why that world was worth keeping. The dead walk, the living build, the systems rise and fall. What endures is the specific human thing, the love that refuses to become practical, the stubbornness that won't accept the mathematics of loss, the particular quality of care that two people show each other in a world that has taken everything else away. There's also the matter of what the show did for its cast, which is worth acknowledging. Andrew Lincoln built a career on Rick Grimes that took him from a well-regarded British television actor to one of the most recognised faces in American drama. Norman Reedus went from a solid but relatively obscure film career to a franchise centrepiece who has now spent more than a decade being Daryl Dixon in multiple countries on multiple continents. Melissa McBride earned, slowly and across many seasons, the recognition that a performance of Carol's sustained complexity deserved. Jeffrey Dean Morgan took what was conceived as a villain role and turned it into a decade of work. Danai Gurira, Lauren Cohan, Chandler Riggs, Stephen Yeun, these are actors whose careers were shaped significantly by the show, and in Yeun's case in particular, whose post-Walking Dead trajectory has been remarkable. He was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actor for Minari in 2021. He won a Screen Actors Guild Award. The kid who played Glenn Rhee from the very first season is, by any measure, one of the finest film actors of his generation. That's a real legacy. The show was, for a significant period, a place where serious actors did serious work and built serious careers. That matters independently of the ratings. The show also changed the cultural conversation about what television could do with horror. Before The Walking Dead, the prestige drama conversation was largely limited to shows that occupied a recognisable literary or dramatic tradition. The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, shows that critics felt comfortable placing alongside great novels or films. Genre was a separate category. Science fiction, horror, fantasy, and well-made and popular, but not quite serious, not quite part of the awards conversation, not quite getting the same critical language applied to them. The Walking Dead cracked that separation, not completely and not alone. Game of Thrones was doing similar work in fantasy simultaneously, but it was part of the shift that made it possible to write about prestige horror as a legitimate form. The Haunting of Hill House, Hereditary, The Night of. The distinction between genre and literary drama was always somewhat artificial, but The Walking Dead's sustained critical and commercial success made it harder to maintain. What you're left with standing back from the whole thing, is a story about a creative work that was quite excellent for a specific period and then became something different over a longer period, and the reasons for the change are legible and interesting. Not a mystery, not a failure of talent, a set of conditions, industrial, commercial, logistical, that changed, and a creative work that changed with them, and an audience that noticed. The show at its peak understood what it was about. And what it was about, underneath the walkers and the fences and the weapons and the blood, was the same thing most good stories are about. People trying to hold on to each other. People failing. People trying again anyway, in the specific, stubborn, irrational human way that makes literature and drama and television worth making at all. That's what the show understood, at its best. And that understanding doesn't go away just because the machine around it eventually lost the thread. So that's the whole arc, more or less. From Kirkman at 24, with a black and white comic and a very specific idea about what zombie stories were supposed to do, to Darabont in a bookstore in Burbank, recognizing something, to a Halloween night in Georgia, a horse on a deserted motorway, a man in a hospital gown standing in the ruins of a world that ended while he was unconscious. To the peak, the Sunday nights when the world was watching together, the most watched show on cable television, built from a story about the end of everything. And then the long, complicated, occasionally beautiful, sometimes frustrating descent through seasons that tested patience, and stories that broke trust and decisions that cost more than anyone could fully calculate at the time they were made. Through the loss of Darabont and Carl and Rick and Glenn and everyone else the show took from you along the way. And then back up slightly in the final seasons, Kang's recalibration, The Whisperers, Season 10's quiet excellence, the finale's graceful final images, Rick still writing, Michonne still riding, the dead still walking behind her, unnoticed, irrelevant, no longer the point. Daryl's out there somewhere in France right now, in whatever the universe of this story considers the present. Maggie and Negan are making their way through Manhattan. Carol is finding something new. The world the show built is still going, in the spin-offs and in the rooms of people who have those early seasons sitting on a shelf or saved in a library, ready to revisit whenever they want to spend a few hours in a place that felt like it mattered. If you're still awake, thank you for spending tonight with this. And if you're not, if somewhere around the dumpster fake out you closed your eyes and let it become background, something warm and familiar to sleep alongside, then that's exactly what this was supposed to do. The girl in the slippers picks up her teddy bear. Rick follows. The world turns out to be what it is. It always was. There's something I find worth sitting with at the end of all of this, which is how much of what made The Walking Dead matter at its best was small. Not the spectacle, not the walker herds or the compound sieges or the season finales, the small things. In the very first episode of The Walking Dead, Rick collapses on the floor of his empty house and calls out for Laurie and Carl. Morgan unable to pull the trigger on his reanimated wife. Carol at the window of the Cherokee Rose Motel. Daryl in the woods. Glenn's face through the revolving door glass. Those images persist because they weren't constructed to persist. They weren't designed as iconic moments. They were just the show being honest, and honesty has a way of staying with you longer than spectacle does. If you've been asleep for the last hour, or 2 hours, or however long it took to drift off, I hope it was good sleep. And if you're still here somehow at this hour, then I hope the company was worth it. If you enjoyed tonight, subscribing to the channel would mean a lot. It helps more than you might expect. There's a lot more of this world to talk about. The seasons individually, the comic in depth, the characters who deserved more time, the spin-offs as they keep going. We'll get to all of it whenever you're ready. But for now, rest. The world can wait until morning.